instead of tearing myself down, instead of tearing that person down, is there an other option for me? And that other option is shadow work, is actively listing all those things about that person that are really difficult for you right now, those things that are triggering you. What are those characteristics, those behaviors, those traits that you're just having a hard time dealing with? Just look at the things that you are the first to judge. Usually those parts of our shadows are the hardest for us to find within ourselves, but we are going to be the first ones to point it out in someone else. And that's a huge, huge, huge flag. That is like the world and the universe, flashing a big red sign. Look deeper. There's something for you here.
Namaste. You're listening to the Sivana podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SivanaSpirit.com, the best place to shop for unique clothing, spiritual handcrafted jewelry, healing gemstones, and fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now, here's your host, Brett Larkin.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Sivana podcast. As always, we've got a really great guest in store for you today. Before we dive in, I want to remind you to head on over to SivanaSpirit.com/contest to enter each and every week for the chance to win an $100 gift card for the Sivana Spirit store. Today, we're embracing the beauty of our darker side. All of us have character traits or emotions like greed or envy that we wish we could change. We have feelings or reactions that we're not proud of. And instead of suppressing these emotions, a technique called shadow work invites us to shine the light on these darker aspects of ourselves. Here to talk with us today about this is my friend Kassandra Reinhardt. Like me, Kassandra teaches primarily on YouTube, where she's one of the world's leading Yin Yoga instructors with over 4 million views. Her videos have served as the introduction to Yin Yoga and the motivation for Yin for thousands and thousands of people, and her book on Yin Yoga will be published by DK Books this fall. So Kassandra, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Oh, I'm so excited for this chat. And to kick it off, I'd love for you to just tell us what shadow work is and how it connects to your big passion, which is Yin Yoga.
Yeah, absolutely. So the shadow is a concept from Carl Jung. So it's a concept of Jungian psychology. And from this notion of the shadow came shadow work. So a shadow, very simply put, is all of those aspects about ourselves, whether that be our personality traits or some behaviors that we don't necessarily like. And our shadow is usually the unconscious part of our personality that we have repressed or denied, or those parts of ourselves that we like to pretend don't exist because they make us feel shame or because we just simply don't like those parts of ourselves. So as you mentioned earlier, this can be like envy, it can be greed, it can be selfishness, all these things that we try to pretend are not a part of our personality that we have then pushed below the surface of our consciousness. So we can be completely unaware of our shadow. And for many of us, we don't really know what makes up our shadow. So we can have a very easy time listing our positive qualities. And even if you ask people, what are your negative qualities, they might be able to list some items, but usually the items that they're going to list are the ones that they are okay admitting to the world and okay admitting to themselves and others. So the shadow is really those parts of our personality that we are not okay admitting to ourselves and admitting to others. And there are dozens and dozens of techniques of how we can bring the shadow back to the light of consciousness and really reintegrate it into our personality. But because I am a yoga teacher, I have found that yoga is the best medium and the best place for us to really dive deep into our shadow, because really I've always gone into the attitude that what happens on our yoga mat is a direct reflection of what happens in our day-to-day life. The two are the same. It's like putting your life under a microscope when you step onto your yoga mat, the way that you behave in a yoga class, whether you are in a public yoga class or you're just unrolling your mat at home and doing your own personal practice, you are going to be triggered in some way. You're going to be confronted with some parts of yourselves, and being on the yoga mat and staying present with your yoga practice can be a way that we can learn to shed some light on our shadow and kind of reintegrate it in that way. So for me, Yin Yoga is what I prefer, and it's what I found to be the most therapeutic and beneficial practice to shed some light on the shadow, simply because if students listening are new or unfamiliar with the practice of Yin Yoga, we do hold passive poses for an extended period of time. So you can be in a challenging pose like pigeon pose, or what we call swan in Yin Yoga, anywhere from 3 to 10 minutes. And if anyone's ever done pigeon pose before, they know that it's pretty intense. So it's a very deep yoga pose. And because we are in the pose for so long, you'll start to notice, for most students, they'll start to notice that there's a bit of an internal dialogue that starts to happen. So these thoughts start to surface up. And usually these thoughts give us an entry point into our shadow. So an example of a thought, let's say you're in pigeon pose. So a normal little verbal cue, that verbal dialogue that might be going around in your head is, wow, this is hard. I hate this pose. I want to come out of this pose. I hate this teacher. Why is she keeping us in pigeon pose so long? Why is this so hard for me? Everyone else seems to be doing fine. No one else seems to feel that this is too intense. There must be something wrong with me. My body isn't working the way that it should. And people will spiral and spiral and spiral. So you could just let that internal dialogue go on forever, and you can let that internal dialogue kind of bring you down and tear you down, or you can decide to actually go into it and become a little bit curious as to where this dialogue is coming from. Why do you hold these beliefs about yourself, and what is the core wound at the essence within it? Why do you feel this way when you are in a specific yoga pose or on your yoga mat? Does that make sense at all?
Yes, you said so many interesting things that I'm like, let's back up. I love it. One of the things you said that I thought was so fascinating was that these shadow aspects of ourselves are emotions that we're not conscious of, that we're not ready to admit to ourselves. And I find that so interesting because I know we both love talking so much about positive talk and, teaching people to think positive, because so many people seem to already be so negative, or they're so down on themselves. But what's so fascinating about what you're saying here is that, well, when people are negative or they're down on themselves, of course that's not good, but they're listing out character traits or things that they're already comfortable admitting, right? Like they're not actually scratching the surface of their unconscious programming that is really driving perhaps a lot of their behaviors. And I mean, that I just find fascinating. So before we even go forward, like how, and maybe yoga is the answer and you're about to tell us, because it's like we want to explore our darker side, but we want to explore the darker side that we're not actually aware of yet. Like not the thoughts we're using to maybe beat ourselves up or thinking all the time. We want to go like way deeper. And you said something about a core wound. Can you tell us more about that before we keep going?
Absolutely. So the most important thing before people start to, because it can be kind of an overwhelming idea to start investigating your shadow, really step number one to finding out what your core wound is so that you can understand what the shadow aspects of yourself are. You need to know how a shadow is created. So how do we actually end up with these shadow parts of ourselves? Because we need to understand how they're created if we're actually going to go seek them out in order to bring them to the surface and bring them to the light. So a shadow happens and is created when your ego over-identifies with a positive characteristic or personality trait that you have determined to be good. So a really clear example and very simple example here that anyone can understand. Let's say, for example, you are a person who is neat and tidy. You like when things are organized and you like when things are done in a certain way and when everything around you is clean. This in itself is not inherently good or bad. It's just a fact. You are a neat and tidy person. So the problem arises when your ego over-identifies with being neat and tidy, and you now associate your self-worth and your goodness with the fact that you are neat and tidy. So maybe somewhere in your childhood, you noticed that your parents would only give you positive love and praise when you would clean up your house or clean up your room. Or maybe at some point during your childhood, a lot of these traumas and core wounds do happen in our first few years of life. So maybe at some point you were negatively punished when you were playing outside and you got dirty and you were called a dirty girl. So as a result, you now try to be neat and tidy. So being neat and tidy is not what's wrong. That's not what we're trying to fix or change about ourselves. The problem is when we associate whatever we label as a positive characteristic with our value, with our self-worth, with what makes us a good and valuable human being. And what's important is that we need to understand that everything has a flip side to it. Every trait, every behavior, every characteristic is like a coin with two sides. So on one side, you have neat and tidy, and on the other side, you have disorganized and messy. So when your ego over-identifies with being neat and tidy, at the same time, it pushes down below the surface, being disorganized and messy. So because you think neat and tidy equals good, equals self-worth, equals value, you have completely repressed all parts of yourself that can sometimes be messy and sometimes be disorganized. And you push it so far below the surface and you associate so much shame around being messy and disorganized that you completely ignore all parts of yourself that have that within it. So that really in a nutshell is how shadow is created. It's just when you over-identify to something that you think is good. The key part here in shedding light to this core wound, the easiest thing to do is to start looking at all those personality traits that you think you have that are good. So if you even just take a piece of paper and you start listing down, I am selfless, I am compassionate, I am neat, I am tidy. The easiest thing is to just write what is the opposite of those traits and characteristics. So if you think you are selfless, the opposite of that is selfish. And you go through that list one at a time. And then when you look at those opposite sides of that coin, you need to really start asking yourself, is it true that I am never those things? Are there any parts of myself that are selfish, that are not that compassionate, that are messy, that are disorganized? The goal is to reintegrate our shadow and bring it back to the life. And this happens all the time on our yoga mat. All the time we are being triggered. Just think of yourself, you're unrolling your yoga mat, you step into a class, and this beautiful, tall, flexible Amazon goddess sets up her mat right next to yours, and she can do every single pose way better than you think you can. What is the dialogue that pops into your head? If you immediately start to judge this person, you want to really look at those judgments. Are the things that you are judging in others, are they really characteristics that are part of that person? Or are you really just projecting parts of your own shadow onto other people, onto your yoga teacher, onto the other people in class within you, onto the people that you meet in your day-to-day life? And that's how you can start to bring that consciousness back into those repressed and usually shame-filled aspects of your personality.
So I love the exercise you gave us about listing our positive qualities on the left side of the page and then coming up with the opposite and putting that on the right. So you said, for example, someone who considers themselves very compassionate might write selfish on the other side of the page. And in integrating or realizing that they have shame around being selfish, does that mean that that person is maybe like not taking care of themselves as much as they should be, or they're not maybe they're so compassionate that they're perhaps not taking care of themselves or don't have boundaries, and by recognizing that they have shame around standing up for themselves or being a little more selfish, they can, am I understanding it right?
Absolutely, because really what happens is that because we have over-identified with those positive traits that are, listed on the left side of that page, the person has told themselves that all those traits that are on the right side, all those negative things, they've told and convinced themselves that those aspects of their personality does not exist within them. They have totally repressed it, but really nothing is inherently bad. Everything has its place. balance. So if you are someone who, for example, prides themselves on being really selfless, gives to charity, gives of their time, always gives to others, then you have maybe over-identified with this quality of being selfless and compassionate and giving, and you have totally repressed those parts of yourself that are selfish and not as giving. And so if you see someone walking, or you encounter someone in your day-to-day life who has a very easy time saying no, who takes more than they give, that person might be the first.
That would trigger you.
Yes, it would trigger you, and you would say, I would never be someone like that. I would never act this way. How dare they do this? Not because you actually think that person is doing something wrong, but because it is reflecting back a part of yourself that you have denied, that you have suppressed. Because let's be honest, being selfish is not always a bad thing. You need to be selfish in order to establish and maintain boundaries that protect your self-worth. You cannot always give. Sometimes you do have to take. So if you're someone that associates being good with being someone that always gives and never takes, when you encounter someone that has an easy time taking, it's going to trigger you. You're going to have a really hard time. And the shadow comes into place where instead of taking a good look at yourself in the mirror and saying, you know what, I should learn from this person and I should find a balance between giving and taking, the unconscious shadow part of yourself is instead going to try to tear that other person down. And it's going to list all the reasons why that person is wrong and you are right, because you are trying to protect your sense of self and your sense of self-worth. And yoga is the perfect place for us to really take a look at ourselves in this way. So Brett, you know me, you know that I love to work with affirmations, right? I work with positive affirmations all the time. I'm a huge fan of it. And always I get people that tell me, well, affirmations are just a form of spiritual bypassing. They are a way to deny the shadow. And those people are right. Using affirmations alone is not enough. What I like to do is when I'm practicing Yin Yoga and when I am teaching Yin Yoga, I will often tell my students some positive affirmations. So an affirmation's like, I love my body exactly the way it is. That's a simple positive affirmation. So let's say students are in pigeon pose, they've been in there for a minute or two, and I'll repeat some affirmations. I love my body just the way it is. Now, this in itself is not enough, in my opinion. What we want to instruct students and what we want to do while we are on the yoga mat is to gauge our reaction to that affirmation. So if, for example, I'm a student and the teacher has put me in pigeon pose and just said, I love my body just the way it is. And as soon as I hear that, my body tenses up and I get really frustrated and I hear a little voice in my head that says, yeah, right. Well, guess what? That's a clue that you've uncovered a shadow and it's asking for you to dive deeper into it. You have to be able to gauge, why are some affirmations easy for me to hear and others are really difficult for me to listen to? Why does my body react positively to some and negatively to others? Usually the ones that you respond positively to are because your ego already identifies with that within yourself. It's easy for you to accept this. The ones that you have a hard time feeling usually are part of your shadow. It's part of a wound that you have not yet healed. So maybe there is a wound within you that thinks that your body is not beautiful, is not worthy, is not good, is dirty, is unclean, whatever it may be. But those positive affirmations are a really beautiful way that we can tap into the shadow. And the reason I tie it in with yoga is because especially Yin Yoga serves as breaking up the physical tension within our bodies. And for some people, for most people, I'll say that it's really hard to jump directly into our shadow. It's hard to make that leap. There is so much shame and so much resistance there. You can't go from 0 to 100. You need to warm up. So by doing Yin Yoga and by actually opening up our physical body, it's then going to become a lot easier to tap into the emotional and into the mental body. So you're kind of just gradually easing yourself into it, which is why I think yoga is such a beautiful practice on so many levels.
I feel like you're giving us such a huge key here, and I love what you're sharing because Affirmations are a hot topic for lots of people, right? Some yogis love them, some are more skeptical. But what you're saying that I haven't heard before, which I think is so powerful, is that it's really us gauging our reaction to those affirmations that's giving us massive, massive clues about ourselves. And I think that's something everyone listening to this podcast can walk away with as just so incredibly valuable. And the other big word that came to mind as we started talking about all of this, and I think you even said it at some point, is balance, right? It's good to have compassion, but selfishness is good too. And it seems like doing this shadow work is really about coming into balance in order to be our best selves and in order to really step into our highest power. And it reminds me and makes me think of like even aligning the chakras or having a chakra that's excessive or deficient, right? In certain aspects. It's so cool. And it also makes me think so much of the Yoga Sutras, where so much of what Patanjali is teaching us is to embrace everything in life as a friendly teacher, right? Embrace everything as your teacher, because it's the same with what you're saying here. When we're getting triggered by someone, instead of going into that downward spiral or protecting our own ego identity, we're able to say, oh, if I'm getting triggered, that means this person, there's something for me to learn here. Not necessarily that they are teaching me something specific, but there's a gold nugget in here for me if I'm getting triggered. So everything that's triggering me is a teacher helping me see how maybe some qualities of mine are either in excess or deficiency, and I can reintegrate some of those parts of myself to find balance.
But that doesn't mean that these people doing bad things and having a bad behavior can't teach you something about yourself. Like you said, it is all about balance. It's about shedding some light. I mean, think of a shadow in your house. The way you get rid of a shadow is to shine some light on it. So for us, the shadow is the subconscious, the unconscious, and the light is our consciousness. So we just want to shed some awareness and shed some light on those parts of ourselves that we just weren't familiar with, that we weren't willing to look at, those parts of ourselves that we have a blind spot to. Because like I said before, it's really easy for most people to name the things that they think they do wrong or to name the negative qualities that they have. But all of us have a blind spot. We all have a handful of characteristics that we are really ashamed of and that are really difficult for us to bring to the surface, because we really would much rather pretend and go on about our daily lives pretending like this is just not true about ourselves. So triggers are a blessing. And this is really what I really want to drive home the most, is for people to start watching their triggers. How are you being triggered and why? Learning to really dive deep into those things that make us feel uncomfortable is where all of the juiciness and all of the enlightenment that we like to talk about, that's where it is. That's where it lives. I found that there are two ways that people react to a trigger, two unhealthy ways, I should say. So if someone triggers you because they are displaying a characteristic or a behavior that you have deemed to be bad and unworthy and not good, you are either going to react by tearing yourself down. So for example, if you're jealous of someone else, you are going to put yourself down because you're going to think, why can't I be more like this person? I suck, I'm worthless, I wish I could do things better like everyone else. So you're either going to tear yourself down or you are going to tear that other person down because you want to make sure that you are right and they are wrong. So shadow work is never about one person being right and the other person being wrong. We are trying to find a little bit of a neutral ground where we can take a step back and ask ourselves, is there a third perspective I could take? Instead of tearing myself down, instead of tearing that person down, is there an other option for me? And that other option is shadow work, is actively listing all those things about that person that are really difficult for you right now. Those things that are triggering you. What are those characteristics, those behaviors, those traits that you're just having a hard time dealing with, just look at the things that you are the first to judge. Usually those parts of our shadows are the hardest for us to find within ourselves, but we are going to be the first ones to point it out in someone else. So for some reason, it's really hard for us to find and identify this flaw within us, but we can spot it a mile away when it's in someone else. And that's a huge, huge, huge flag. That is like the world and the universe, flashing a big red sign. Look deeper. There's something for you here. Why is it that you can spot this flaw in everyone else, but you simply cannot see it within yourself? Those blind spots are the blind spots that we really need to tune into and that we need to be open to investigating. And it might be painful. It might be difficult. It might uncover a lot of wounds that you've been carrying around for years and years and years. So this is not easy, and it's not something that's going to happen once. So for example, I had a wound of jealousy where I found myself being really jealous of specific people that I, looked up to and had just a hard time seeing them. Every time I would see this person, I would get completely triggered and I would feel really jealous and I would tear myself down, or I would try to tear them down. And once I kind of started practicing shadow work and I started actively listing, write down all the things about that person that triggers me, it wasn't enough for me to just do this exercise once. My gut instinct is still to be jealous. However, the time I spend in jealousy is now, instead of being 20 minutes, it's now 5 seconds. It still happens. So you're not completely going to eradicate that gut reaction, because most of us have learned these shadows or have created these shadows from a very, very young age. So it's going to take time to really bring this to the light. But you will start noticing very quickly that the time you spend either tearing other people down or tearing yourself down is going to dramatically reduce over time as you start to shed more and more light on your shadow.
Which is so amazing, because that's what yoga is all about, having equanimity in our mind, right? So the less time we can spend destroying ourselves or others mentally is a huge, huge win. I want to ask you more about tracking these triggers, because daily life is so fast, right? And so often we might feel like triggered or slightly irritated, and it doesn't even catch our radar. So I'm wondering what techniques you've used to try to really catch these things in their tracks. I know when I was doing a lot of self-work a couple of years ago, I was using Evernote on my phone to write down a little bit similar to this, not exactly the same thing, but do you have tips like that of how people can kind of really try to catch themselves in the moment? I mean, obviously when we're on the yoga mat, it's a great place, but I know so often it's just in the quick chaos of daily life that these triggers are happening.
Absolutely. And to be honest, it can be quite difficult to spot it in the moment. It gets easier the longer you've been practicing this, but at first it's going to be really hard. So I'm a huge fan of journaling. And honestly, even when I'm on my yoga mat now, if I'm going to a public yoga class, I make sure that I bring a piece of paper or a journal, because you need to start observing the way that you react to certain things. So for example, in a yoga class, how do you react when a teacher suggests a really difficult pose? Are you able to welcome challenges, or do you immediately either tear down and attack the teacher, tear down and attack the other students, all of this in your head usually, or do you immediately attack and tear down yourself? So I like to have always a piece of paper when I'm in a yoga class, just so I can note down what was my reaction to a certain thing. Another great practice that people can do is to practice affirmations in forms of guided meditations. So I'm a huge fan of doing this either once or twice a day if I can, because like you said, it can be difficult in a fast-paced world in your day-to-day life. We don't all necessarily have the time to take our notebook out and start journaling, when we're right in the middle of work. But I find that if I start my day by already being aware of the affirmations I have a difficult time with, it's going to be that much easier easier for me to spot them coming up to the surface in my day-to-day life. So my favorite practice to do, and I think I've mentioned this to you before, I like to record myself stating positive affirmations. I find that affirmations are a lot more powerful if I hear them from my own voice than from someone else telling them to me. So I will record myself stating some positive affirmations about money, about relationships, about my home, whatever it may be. And then in the morning, I just take 5 to 10 minutes. Sometimes I do it as a formal meditation where I sit down. Sometimes I just listen to it in my car when I'm, in a rush and need to go somewhere. So I'll listen to those affirmations and I just make sure that morning to note down which ones did I have a hard time hearing this morning? Which ones felt a little awkward? There are usually two feelings that will come up. One is sadness and one is anger. The sadness feeling that you might feel usually is an inclination that you are tearing yourself down. A frustrating or angry feeling is usually an indication that your gut reaction is to tear down others. So when I have those 10 minutes in the morning just to go through my affirmations, it has a lot of positive effects because one, those affirmations that I don't have any shadow associated to are gonna pump me up. They're gonna make me feel really good and really positive for a day ahead. So already I'm starting my day on a positive note so that most of my interactions are already probably going to be fairly positive. But then the other benefit is that those affirmations that I had a hard time hearing, I already have some form of consciousness that, you know what, I have a bit of work to do on this today. And I already know that I might be triggered in this way throughout the day. So because I already have that awareness, no matter how busy or quick my day-to-day life might be, I already am not looking for them, but I'm already receptive to noticing those triggers. And then at the end of the day is when I have more time, and that's usually when I'm going to journal. One powerful practice that I had to work with for at least a year, as I mentioned before, jealousy was a huge trigger of mine. It was something that I've really found myself spiraling into time and time again. So shedding light on it is one thing, but then you also need to correct the behavior in a way. So for me, whenever I found myself being jealous of someone else, instead of just shining light on it, being aware that this was what was happening, I would take it one step further and I would make it a conscious effort to compliment whoever it was I was jealous of. So I would totally flip the behavior around. Instead of tearing myself down or tearing them down, I would boost that person up. I would highlight in them all those things that were triggering me. I would frame it in a positive way and I would communicate it to them. They got a boost, they felt great about themselves, and all of a sudden, that jealousy just evaporated. It was gone and I felt really, really great. So I highly recommend, if you're someone who struggles with jealousy, start actively practicing to speak those things out loud and frame it in the form of a compliment, and actively speak those things out to others. It will make you feel a whole lot better.
Yeah, this reminds me of, again, Yoga Sutra's Pratipashka Bhavana, where Patanjali talks about just cultivating the opposite. So it's such a great example that you gave with jealousy, but I think even people listening, if you have different shadows that you're working with, just cultivating the opposite is such a great tool and something that's most likely going to help. So if you're that person who's so compassionate but needs to set up some boundaries, like practice saying compassionate no's, like even when it's things you want to do, right? And just take it in the other direction in order, again, to find balance. I love that. And I'm so excited about this idea of the affirmations as triggers, because I just think that's so cool. I want to talk next about physically what we can do, taking it a little bit more into our yoga mat and our physical body, because we've talked about shining the light on these perhaps darker emotions. Now, does that mean we're sending the breath into a certain part of the body potentially? How does this now integrate with the physical?
So the physical is a huge gateway into the emotional and into the mental. You are a yoga teacher, so you're familiar with this concept, but for other students or maybe people listening in, there is this notion in the yoga world that many emotions are physically stored and manifested within our physical body. You know, a lot of people say that hip openers can be very triggering and can provoke some emotional releases. So I don't necessarily think that one kind of pose will provoke one kind of emotion, but I like to tell people to just be open to the entire wheel of emotions that may or may not surface on your yoga mat. So absolutely, the first thing, and this is why Yin Yoga is so great, just because Yin Yoga is held for such a long time, you're in a pose for, 3 to 5 minutes on average. So you do actually have the time to start looking into the physical sensations that you feel within a pose. What does this pose feel like? Where do I feel this yoga pose? And like you said, send your breath directly into it. So when you are in a yoga class, let's say you're not doing Yin Yoga and you're doing something that's a little bit more active and a little bit more fast-paced, like Ashtanga or Vinyasa or Power Yoga, you don't necessarily have as long to question yourself in the pose, but that doesn't mean that you necessarily need 5 minutes in order to have a little bit of awareness. What's important is that when you are stepping onto your yoga mat, you want to use those first few minutes to ground yourself and to set your intention. In most classes, the teacher will guide students to set an intention at the beginning of their practice. If you know that shadow work is something that you want to start working on in yourself, your intention, that's what it should be at the beginning of class. So already set the intention as soon as you step onto your yoga mat that you are going to pay extra attention to the signals your body is sending you, so that when you are moving, you can notice where there is stagnancy, where there is resistance, where there is discomfort. And if it's a physical discomfort, you want to be able to ask yourself, is this purely physical or is there something more to this? The discomfort can either arise from the posture. I mean, maybe you're just, tighten your hips and this pose is kind of challenging and your hips are tight and that's all there is to it. So maybe the discomfort is purely physical and you notice yourself tighten up because the pose is just challenging. That's fine. But maybe you notice yourself tightening up because the teacher said one word that just triggered you or that just rubbed you the wrong way. Or maybe your physical body tensed up because instead of focusing on your breath and on your practice, you started to look around the room and all of a sudden you are comparing your practice with the practice of the other people around you. And you are no longer with your breath. You are no longer with your intention. You have left your body and you are deep, deep, deep into your shadow, deep into the unconscious. So for me, setting the intention is the most powerful thing that I can do. And then it's always just having an inquisitive nature. Why do I feel this way? It's not enough to just say, I feel tense. Okay, you feel tense, but why? Is it because the physical posture is uncomfortable? Or is it because you've been triggered in some way and the discomfort is manifesting itself in your physical body because your emotional body is simply not ready to acknowledge this feeling yet?
One of the reasons it seems like yin is such a great complement to this work is because for me, I think in a vinyasa practice or in a more flow type practice, I can definitely notice the trigger, but there's not that extra time to sort of dig into why, right? Because we're moving on and we're doing the next pose. And so that's where, if you have your journal or you have that notebook, you can jot it down to maybe explore later. But in yin, because you are holding those postures for such a longer amount of time and breathing into your connective tissue and really sort of unwinding the physical body, you also have that time mentally to sort of like get to the core of the issue potentially, just because there's more time allotted. And if someone, sometimes it might take a lot longer than even 5 minutes in a yin pose. So for those folks who are like, because it can be really tricky, it's like, what's going on behind what's really going on? We talked about journaling, which I also love. I'm wondering, is meditation an appropriate place to explore some of these? Or what other tips when it's like getting to the core of why this is a shadow or why this is part of your DNA or was part of your childhood? How can we investigate that?
Meditation is huge, and if you can do some kind of body scan or chakra meditation, you might find that even more beneficial. So this is a very simple meditation that anyone can do, either sitting cross-legged or you can even do it lying down. So just doing a simple body scan where you are focusing your awareness and your mind from the crown of your head and all the way down into your fingertips and toes, and really taking the time to breathe into every little single part of your body and noticing where there is tightness, where there is discomfort, where there is pain, and not necessarily just physical pain, but maybe there's an emotional component to it. Maybe there's a texture, a color, a feeling that you can actually label and associate to certain parts of your body. So some people, when they're doing this body scan meditation, they might feel like, my right shoulder feels a little blue. It feels a little sad. And this might sound a little silly if you've never done it before, but if you're really able to get to that space where you're open to anything and you're open to the experience, doing a simple body scan meditation can really help you uncover a lot of stuff, just a lot of junk that you might have that's accumulated, maybe just from your work day or maybe from the last decade or so. And one thing that I will note about those vinyasa, power Ashtanga yoga classes where you don't really have the time, like in Yin, to really dig deep into something, for me, what I've found is that a lot of the work from those yoga classes comes when the yoga class is over. So people should really be very in tune and very open to looking at the way they interact with others after that yoga class. If you've been in a vinyasa yoga class and for some reason you have been triggered and it's highlighting a part of your shadow, while you're still moving and breathing in that class, you might not actually have, mentally have the time to explore it because the teacher is already on the next pose, and you're just kind of going. So after that class is over, what's important is the next 24 hours. So over those next 24 hours, odds are that shadow that was triggered in that vinyasa yoga class wants to be dealt with. It wants to come to the surface. And this is a point that I forgot to mention, but that's really, really crucial, I think, is that your shadow wants to come to the light. It wants to come to the surface, and it's going to do anything and everything in its power to make sure that you acknowledge it and that you see it. So really start to observe the way you feel and the way you interact with others after a yoga class. So it's not just the time you spend on your mat, but it's the time you spend afterwards. So the body scan meditation is great. I personally, when I'm doing a meditation, I like to do a guided meditation, an affirmations meditation, because for me, that's just the way that I respond the best, but it doesn't need to be that way. A chakra meditation is also really powerful because the chakras all have their own flavor, their own intent, their own aspect of your personality reflected in those chakras. So if you start from your root, start with your tailbone, and you really look at that space, at that first chakra, and you take the time to breathe into that space, to feel the energy circulate, and to check in and tune in. Does it feel free-flowing? Does it feel a little bit stagnant? Does it feel uncomfortable, painful, sad, angry, frustrated, happy? What does it feel like there? That's going to be your clue that maybe there is a shadow that is associated with this chakra and with what this chakra represents. So if your first chakra feels a little bit stuck, feels a little bit stagnant, you might have some money blocks. You might have a part of your shadow that has a very hard time dealing with safety and security, that has a hard time dealing with money, that maybe judges other people when they have money. And maybe when you do this work, you realize that you have over-identified with being selfless, with being giving, with being charitable, and you have totally neglected your own needs for safety, security, and financial stability. So chakra meditation is awesome, and I definitely recommend that.
Yeah, one of my favorite practices right now is to actually just place my hands on the associated chakra for whatever I'm feeling or going through, and just doing a breath-based meditation, even lying down and visualizing that chakra like a glass, and my breath is like filling it up with water. I almost think of it as like those electric cars I see at the supermarket that go into those like charging stations, but just like filling that chakra up, filling myself up with love and balance. And it seems like as people dive into shadow work, they can be triggered by external events like, the person they're jealous of or someone saying a certain thing, but that we need to do body scan and be aware of physical sensations as well, because those could be clues of places that have emotional components that are maybe we need to look at or have been unresolved. I mean, it reminds me of like John Sarno's work on back pain, where it's like basically people's back pain could be cured just by them dealing with certain emotional issues or changing their mindset around certain things. So it sounds like this work can really go both ways, and I'm so excited that you got to share all this with us. Any last big tips or parting words about shadow work specifically that you want to share with us before we wrap up?
Yes, one thing that I forgot, and this can be really easy, really helpful, because for most of us, our shadow is our blind spot. So when I tell people like, okay, look into your shadow, well, they think, well, how? I mean, it's my blind spot for a reason, I can't see it. So what's easy, or what's really helpful, is that what's so easy for us is to spot other people's shadows. And this can be a good way to start your practice. So one of my favorite and easiest practices is to notice when you notice other people judging or gossiping about others. So if your friend wants to come over and gossip about others or says a judgment about someone else, this is their shadow being reflected. So when you see someone else's shadow reflected, this is your opportunity to ask yourself, could this also be my shadow? Do I share this judgment? Am I inclined to also gossip with this friend because maybe them gossiping and them judging is giving me permission to validate my own shadow. So it can be quite challenging to look at yourself first. So when you're just starting off, start to observe the people around you, notice their tendencies, and honestly, because our shadow wants to come to the surface, you'll find it fairly easy to point out other people's shadows. So every time you see it reflected in someone else, just take a moment to ask yourself, could this also be a part of my shadow? Is this also something that I could work on? So use other people as guides and really look at the behaviors of other people around you as a way to get a reflection and insight into your own blind spots.
I love it. I'm picturing like everyone around me, like little shimmering mirrors who can help me figure out my own blocks. I love it. Kassandra, thank you so much for talking with us, sharing this, what I think is really life-changing work. Let people know, where can they find you if they want to connect with you and learn more before we sign off?
Absolutely. So my website is yogawithkassandra.com. Kassandra is spelt with a K, and they can also find me on YouTube by searching Yoga with Kassandra. I would love for them to connect with me. This is really a subject that I am so passionate about sharing with the world because it's taught me so much and it's helped me in so many ways, and I can really see the ways that it can help others as well.
Amazing. And I'll make sure to put both of those links in the description below. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Hi everyone, Brett here with an announcement. We are starting a weekly contest giveaway over at Sivana Spirit. If you'd like to enter the contest to win one of our weekly prizes, go to savanaspirit.com/contest. If you enjoyed listening to the podcast today, would really appreciate it if you went over to iTunes and left us a review. Leave us some comments. We love your feedback, and share this podcast with anyone who you think might also enjoy it. I also wanted to invite you to go check out Sivana East, which is the name of our blog, and also the name of our Facebook group, where you can ask questions, see who's coming on the show, and share your ideas. We will post the most recent episodes there, as well as interesting articles relating to our guests and topics on the shows. Again, thank you so much for listening, and from my heart to yours, namaste.
You've been listening to the Sivana podcast. To find out more about Sivana, go to savanaspirit.com or follow Sivana on Facebook at facebook.com/SivanaSpirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savanaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Sivana podcast.